Welcome to the Kent Lapp Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast, TJ.
Thanks, man. Glad to be on.
This is quite a privilege. It's nice to be able to sit across from you on a table on a Monday afternoon and just look you in the eyes a little bit. Like, this is like a rare privilege.
Man,
I mean, you're my pastor, which is like, I mean, we so appreciate you and your work at Immanuel, and you guys just jumped in, to kind of taking over the lead pastor thing from Ray, and you're busy, and we're all busy, but here we are, man.
But to be clear, I'm not just your pastor. I'm your brother elder too.
Yes.
And elders are equals. So
yes.
This is more like a leadership meeting right now, right?
I love it. Yeah, and I'm grateful for it, man. I'm grateful for you. Andrew is too, right, Andrew? Did we not get you a mic back there? Okay, all right, that's fine. Andrew's over here.
Present.
There we go. TJ, why don't we jump in with giving people an overview on what you do and kind of how you got here?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm the lead pastor at Immanuel Nashville, which is still a fairly young church. A lot of times people don't realize that because of Ray Ortlund's influence and the name of Immanuel. They sometimes show up and they expect to see, I think, more. But we're a church plant, and we're about 12 years old now. And so it's a lot of work. It's not like I do more than preach, and I love it. I don't think I would enjoy as much a kind of narrow lane of ministry. I like the breadth of it. So that's what I do with most of my time. And I'm a dad. I got 3 kids and one that will be here Christmas time. So
yes.
Three little girls and a little boy on the way.
Yes. Congratulations again.
Thanks,
so Christmas time, huh?
Yeah.
So 2020?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
How late would he have to be to not come in 2020?
Well, he's due on December 27th.
Oh, okay. So not very.
Yeah. So hopefully, we're hoping to spend Christmas at home because of this weird COVID season. You can only have 2 people in the hospital, so it would just be me and my wife. But we're hoping that doesn't land on Christmas.
Yeah,
because we want to spend Christmas with the girls. Obviously, we have little girls. They're all 3 below the age of 6. So
yes. Yes,
Christmas
busy time
morning,
with the Tim's household.
It's fun, man. Christmas is fun. We're having a blast.
Do you think that your enjoyment of like the breadth of ministry which you have at Immanuel is from your kind of your entrepreneurial background?
Maybe so.
Or is that just how you've kind of always been?
I don't know. I like building things. I was a builder before I became a pastor. Well, that's kind of not true. I was a youth pastor years ago as well. But in terms of professions, I was a builder before I became a pastor full time. And I wasn't just a builder of, things, commercial and residential buildings, but, I like the building of the company itself. I like the getting it off the ground and all that's involved in it.
Yep.
So a church plant, which is what Immanuel really is. Now I didn't have to get it off the ground. That hard work was done. The heavy lifting was done by Pastor Ray Ortlund, but it's still in the developing phases as an organization. I like that aspect of it. Now I also like not being the executive pastor because there's a lot of things like payroll and those kinds of things. I don't want to think about that. I'm no good. Nobody wants me thinking about that.
Right. Yep.
So, but I like that. I suppose there's a kind of carryover.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord knew what he was doing.
Yeah, most certainly. How about then a brief overview from how you got here to lead pastor at Immanuel, like where you're from, and just kind of a bit of a journey to how you got here?
Well, it's complicated, I suppose, like everybody's story. Mine is further complicated by the fact that my parents were divorced when I was 5 years old, I think, something like that. The point is, I was young enough, I don't remember it. And so I kind of lived in 2 different places. My mom and dad lived a few hours away from one another. And both of them remarried. 2 great homes, really. I don't have there are a lot of terrible divorce stories, and divorce is never fun. But mine is, I was loved no matter where I was. And so I had 2 Christmases. It was pretty great. There were a lot of really nice things about it. And so I lived in 2 different worlds, really. And a lot of people don't realize this about Alabama, where I'm from. But depending on where you are in Alabama, you get very different cultures. And so I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, which till high school. And Huntsville was a wonderful place to grow up. It's one of the first cities, I think, in Alabama that had sidewalks that went everywhere. So you could get on your bike as a kid and not come home, all day long, and you never had to get on a road. You were never in any, danger like that. You just stayed on sidewalks and visited your friends, and it was a diverse place. My friends were Black and Indian and Asian, and
Really?
yeah.
Because see, I wouldn't think that.
Yeah,
I wouldn't think that like Huntsville, Alabama. I
know.
wouldn't think it'd be that diverse.
Yeah, it was. I think largely because of NASA and all of the industries that surround an industry like the space industry. So engineering, things like that. My grandfather was an engineer. That's how my family ended up there. So it was. That was my world. Now, when I was, nearing high school age, I moved to live with my dad. Not because there was anything wrong with my mom, but because, a young guy, I wanted to be around my dad more. And so I moved to Pell City, Alabama. Now, Pell City is right next to Talladega, and that's maybe the best way I can locate it.
Okay.
And it tells you a lot about, the culture there. It was more of a, a sort of, deep South Alabama culture, A lot of beautiful things about a small town. If I skipped school in high school, which I did a few times, somehow word would get back around to my dad before the end of the day.
Okay.
It was that kind of town.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful to grow up there too, but very different culture. I think that's the first place I realized that racism was like alive and well. It just wasn't on my radar until I moved there. So those two worlds, I suppose, shaped me a lot in what I want and what I expect. And from there, went to from Pell City, so went to high school there, and then went to Samford University in Birmingham, which was a wonderful experience as well. It's like a little microcosm of Nashville. Honestly, there's so many Nashville people that come to Samford in Birmingham. Little private college, great school, small classes, good education. But I didn't finish there. I finished at Southeastern Bible College in Birmingham, which was a great little Bible college. But played football at Samford. Really enjoyed my time there. I wish I could do it again.
Oh, really?
Yeah, not being so stupid this time around.
Okay.
I thought this is terrible. Like I have to show up and people they make me work out.
Yeah.
They make me eat 3 meals a day at this cafeteria. Looking back now, I hit the lottery. I didn't even know it.
Yeah.
So I wish I could go back and not be an idiot and enjoy it and actually, do better than I give it my best shot, which I really didn't do.
Do you think in the new earth that we get a chance to like do some of that stuff again or not necessarily?
I don't know. I think we just have the luxury of not being an idiot the first time around. So, it was a great experience there though. And the best thing that I took out of Pell City, Alabama was my wife. We went to high school together.
Oh, okay.
And,
yeah, that's where you met Jessica.
Yeah, that's where Jessica and I met. And
yep.
Her dad was my 9th grade football coach. And
oh, wow, I didn't know that.
I met her as a cheerleader the first time.
No way. Jessica was a cheerleader.
She was, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So but we didn't start dating until the summer before our senior year. So we were just classmates.
Yep.
But it's really nice to have that shared memory together.
That is very cool.
Mm-hmm.
And then when did you know you were called to be a pastor? When did you want to be a pastor? When did that start?
Yeah, great question. I didn't want to be a pastor for most of my, life. And
do you now?
I do now. It's this is a testament to how God changes not only, what we do, but what we want to do. Changes the desire. I was just reading this morning at the end of 1 Chronicles. David, King David, the sort of iconic king of the Bible, prays for his son Solomon as he's nearing as David's nearing his death, and he prays that God would give him a whole heart. And it occurred to me as I was reading that this is something that only God can do. We can modify our behavior, but only God can actually change our desires. It changes at that level. And it's the very thing he's been doing since the beginning. And that's why David prayed for that. So God changed my heart. I wanted to be, I don't know what I wanted to be, maybe a musician or something like that. I've always loved music, played music. And in 2009, I went to a Gospel Coalition conference in just outside of Chicago. And John Piper preached a sermon, I think it was from 1 Timothy, fanning into flame the gift of God. And it was classic John Piper, fanning into flame the white hot gift of God, I think, or the white hot flame or something. You know, it's just so passionate.
Mm-hmm.
And as he was preaching, he made me uncomfortable. You know, that kind of show of emotion, I suppose.
Mm.
But as he was preaching, I just felt the Lord was saying to me, this is why you're on the planet, to actually do what this man is doing, to preach. And something in me changed. I didn't know how to get there. I didn't know, even what I was signing up for. But I wanted from that moment on to preach. And it changed the trajectory of my life.
You were living in Nashville at the time?
Well, Jessica and I were living in Birmingham, I believe.
Okay.
We were.
So this is pre-Immanuel.
Yes. So this was, So in 2009, we were newly married and pretty directionless. I was. Jessica had a career. She was a nurse, and she took the wise route through school. It took her the appropriate amount of time, and she had a job. Those kinds of things. Her degree paid for itself.
Yeah.
I did not, and I was just floundering. And the Lord gave me a desire that changed the direction of my life in that moment. And almost immediately, I went home and said to Jessica, all right, I got to do this. And I have no idea how to do it. But I knew it meant I need to study more. Actually, during that time, John Piper referenced the importance of being able to read the Greek text of the New Testament. He said something in passing. And so that was sort of, I'm sitting there thinking, I'm not equipped yet. So we decided, all right, we're going to do some kind of a master's program. And Jessica helped me to find my way to King's College in London. And that was her idea. And so that started my pathway toward Immanuel. Of course, I didn't know that then.
Yeah. So let's follow you said master's, King's College, London. And then, because let's come back around to that when we talk about your thesis from your PhD studies.
Mm-hmm.
But can you kind of get us up to, well, let's connect the dots between, then you joined master's at King's College, London. Then kind of what were the big markers between then and Immanuel then? Yeah,
well, King's College is where I finally said, I care about learning. I just, I didn't study really at all until I got into that program at King's College. And an appetite emerged from that desire to learn. So I did the program there. It went really well. But I learned and read everything I could.
Mm.
So, somewhere in the Mon Library, which is the big King's College library, there's kind of a worn out spot on the floor next to the works of Jonathan Edwards, because I just sat there on the library floor next to Edwards, just reading him for hours on end. And I did that with C.S. Lewis, several other people. It wasn't part of my regular reading, but the Lord gave me a desire to learn, which of course meant reading a lot and writing. And so what King's College did for me really was just whet my appetite for learning. And I thought, I got to keep going. This isn't enough. And I had a great experience there. There was a guy there called Alistair McGrath, who was a good historical theologian, and learned a lot. But it just showed me how far there is to go. There's so much to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And my PhD really taught me that. I know just a little bit about a very little. And that, I suppose that's a trajectory I carry over even to today. I want to be on a growth edge all my days, So leaving there, we decided the Lord was leading me in the direction of some kind of a PhD program. And we thought it was going to be Vanderbilt. So that's one of the reasons we ended up in Nashville. And
Oh, really?
I had family here. Yeah. And so I did, I was applying for a PhD in historical theology. And that process was going well until I got to the interview portion where, they're sort of sizing me up and I'm sizing them up. And it just wasn't going to be a good fit. I could tell from talking to them and seeing myself through their eyes, I'm not really called to historical theology. I'm not called to the university. I'm so glad there are people who are. I kind of wish I was one of them. But it was clearly not going to be, years spent in Latin and in the classroom. It was just not going to satisfy me.
I see. Yeah.
So I pulled the plug on that. And so here we are, we relocated thinking this is in the bag. I had good references, I thought it's in. And so all of a sudden I'm here in Nashville with 2 degrees in theology. And, what do you do with 2 degrees in theology?
Yep.
Like, where do you work if you're not going to work at a church? And I just didn't feel called to. I had a couple offers on the table, churches to go to, but I just didn't feel my heart was in it. And how do you accept that kind of thing if your heart's not all the way in it? It's not that my heart wasn't given to the Lord, but I just didn't feel like I could jump into these roles I was being offered. So I did the only other thing I know how to do, and that is build stuff. And the only reason I know how to do that's because I did it in the summers and then after I graduated for a little while with a friend of mine's dad's company. So I started a construction company in Nashville on probably the eve of the biggest construction boom Nashville's ever seen, And
is this 09, 10?
Yeah, this would have been 2000, probably 2011.
Okay. All right.
And it just took off. I mean, I never advertised anything, just word of mouth. And I suppose part of me thought, I'm pretty good at this, but I was terrible at it. I was really not good. I apologize right now if anybody's listening that I did a job for.
I'm sure the work was great.
It was my best. I can say that. I gave it my best shot. But
You're probably the best educated construction business owner in Nashville, I would think.
Well, I had a lot of good conversations with homeowners and people.
Yeah.
That I enjoyed the social aspect of it.
Yeah.
But I just, it was just like shooting fish in a barrel. And so the Lord blessed it, and it enabled Jessica and I, it bought us time to put down roots and, to figure out what's the way forward. And that's when we started coming to Immanuel, just as members. And eventually I became an elder, but we were just looking for a church that, I don't know, that where we felt like we could belong. We had visited other churches and we felt like all the friend groups were kind of formed already. And I sat in a wonderful church for 3 months listening to great preaching. And for 3 months, nobody ever spoke to me. So we just, walked out after attending 12 times and thought the Lord's just not calling us here. You know? So, and that sort of shaped the way I think about Immanuel now.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's insightful. Most certainly. Let's not allow that to happen at our church.
Yeah, it's easy.
Let's not let someone come in and visit for 3 months and not be talked to.
I know. Yeah. Yeah. It reinforced me the importance of, church culture, not just the theology of the church, but what are the expectations that everyone has? What do they think is the point of Sunday morning? That kind of thing. I love the way Ray Ortlund Sr. He says, there's two ways to walk into a room. Here I am, and oh, there you are.
Yes.
And we just always want to stay in that second category.
Yeah, that's such a good. Well, that's just such a good saying, mantra, whatever. It's short, it's catchy, it's memorable, it's profound. That had to come from an Ortlund. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no kidding.
Because Ray mentioned that a few years ago, and it's always stuck.
Yeah.
I still feel like I'm bad at it, to be honest.
Oh, me too.
But it's there and it's well put, and I remember that quite frequently and try to act on it. So it's helpful in that way. September the 8th of 2019 was that Pastor Ray's last day as lead pastor at Immanuel, and then you took over. It was September of 19 in any case, right?
That's right.
So here we are, November of 2020. So it's a year and a couple of months. So it's just crazy how fast it's going. What are what are your thoughts on the transition? What worked, and what would you recommend other pastors do different?
Man, I don't think we have enough time to chase this out in detail because it was such a big deal. I suppose that's the first thing, right? Like acknowledging right out of the gate, a pastoral succession is a big deal. Now, it might be, it's always a big deal. It might be easier if the church is a smaller church. But when you get into what, Tim Keller calls a large church, when you get into 600 to 900 people, trending on a very large church, it becomes, it's hard to get 600 to 900 people or 1,000 people, we'll just say for a nice round number, to go from point A to point B together. It takes so much planning. Have mercy on your pastors because they're behind the scenes. They're just trying not to leave anyone behind and get everybody moving in the same direction positively for Jesus. So that's hard anyway. A pastoral succession is just a big task. And the elders of Immanuel, I think, wisely recognize we have to get a big head start on this. Now, they knew when Ray had announced from the very beginning that when he was 70, he wanted to step down as lead pastor. And we don't use the word retire because, in truth, he's busier now than, maybe he's ever been.
Mm-hmm.
So knowing that was on the horizon helped the elders to do a lot of long-term planning. So even before I came on as an elder, they were already talking to, potential next lead pastors. It was just like casual conversations, to see is there any interest at all, so that they wanted to have a someone in place way ahead of time, because so much of what makes a church is intangible. I mean, it's not the doctrinal statement. It's not the stuff you can read. It's the intangibles of the culture, the vibe, and the lead pastor and the elders they must be the embodiment of the culture. You have to be able to look at them and say, well, yeah, that's what we're after. That's what we want for other people. We want men that look like that. So they wanted to have someone in place, I think 3 or 4 years out. I think 3 was the minimum, 4 would be ideal. And I don't know at what point my name came up. I certainly was not about to throw it in the ring. It's too weighty of I needed a kick out of the door. Because I revere the ministry of Immanuel. I mean, it's not just a church to me. It's my home. It's where literally my best friends are. My spiritual aunts and uncles are. It's my family. So I don't want to mess it up. I mean, I have a selfish reason here. I want it to work for me, because this is where Immanuel is where Jessica and I first felt forgiven. Now, we knew we were Christians when we came to Immanuel. We knew our sins are forgiven, but we just didn't feel very forgiven. And about a year into the preaching of the gospel at Immanuel, and the emphasis on the free grace of God, and the doorway, I think, into self-forgiveness, which is walking in the light, honesty. That combination changed us. We didn't even know what was happening. And about a year in, I looked over at Jessica on the way home one day, and I think after church, I said something like, I think I finally feel forgiven. I've known I've been forgiven, but I didn't feel very forgiven. I feel my sins have been taken away. I feel, like I'm living in an exhale, So, and she felt the same way. So that I still don't want to mess that up for anybody. So the elders actually approached me. I don't know when it was, probably 2015. And I was in place as assistant pastor around 2016, I think. So I was there 3 years. And when I first came on as assistant pastor, no one knew that they had talked to me about becoming lead pastor, because we were testing it out. Romans 12, that by testing you may discern the will of God. So that time of non-pressured pastoral ministry was really important to me.
Mm-hmm.
It enabled me to just learn and preach and do normal pastor stuff with Ray's coaching without everybody looking at me and thinking like, oh, you better come on along.
Right.
You better speed it up. You're not going to make it.
Yeah. And at that point, no one outside of the elders and maybe a select group had knowledge that you were on track to become the next lead pastor, correct? And
that's right.
Matter of fact, you didn't even know, like, it was being discussed and you were testing it, but it wasn't a given, right?
No, it wasn't.
Certainly, because I remember when we first started having discussions, which, by the way, that does seem to me like one of the things that Ray and the elders did very well, was giving this long on-ramp. I mean, if you say, like, even from the beginning, that was in 2009 or 10, like, that was 10 years.
That's right.
That people knew, hey, in a decade that Ray's going to be transitioning, which when something's 10 years out, it's like, well, that just seems so far away. And it is. But when it gets to 5 years out, it's like, boom, it's here so quickly. But that does seem to me like one thing that Ray and the elders at the time did such a good job at is building in a long on-ramp.
Yes.
And setting the expectations. I remember when Marianne and I went through the new member seminar at Immanuel, Ray taught it was down in the gathering place, and it was on a Saturday from like 10 to 1 or something like that, or 9 to 1. And that was the first, we'd been visiting, but that was the first that we'd heard that he's going to be transitioning out.
Wow.
In like 2 or 3 years, whatever that was at that point. And that was hard to hear because we really loved Ray's preaching and everything.
Yeah.
But then also it was also good for us to hear, because then we needed to make the conscious decision that we're going to join this church for basically how God is working through the church, and not for Ray.
That's right.
And it was good for people to kind of know, even a few years out, that he's going to be transitioning when he's 70. Because then if people keep coming on board, then they're there for the work of the Lord and not just Ray.
Yes.
And so, I think the long on-ramp was good. But I remember then when it came time to like have discussions like with the church about this thing, and like actual like family gatherings and that type of thing, we were in on a couple of those meetings. And, my understanding was like, sure, you were being coached and brought along, but it was not a given that you were going to be the next lead pastor.
That's right.
And the group or whoever was reading books and talking to the experts and everything about like how to do this transition properly, and like looking for the next lead pastor. Sure, you were one of them, but it wasn't a given. It certainly wasn't a given at that point that you would be the next lead pastor. And I remember at one of the family gatherings, it was just like, I think even someone might have even said it in the back left corner. I don't remember who it was, but the comment was just like, "Hey, what is anyone thinking about TJ here?"
Yeah.
So, which I think was great, because it's like, you are the next lead pastor of Immanuel, certainly because it's the will of the Lord. Like, that was the call of God on your life, and in the sovereign plans of God, you are the lead pastor at Immanuel. But even beyond that, it's not like it was a given that you just happened to be around and you were the handy man to pick for this. It was like, no, we did all the due diligence. We consulted the experts. We read books. We took years for this. We looked across the country or the world for like the best fit to have, to find someone to be the next lead pastor at Immanuel. And praise God, as it turns out, the best man in the world for this job at this time is TJ Timms, and he's right here among us. Like, that was how that process seemed to go. That's how I perceived it to be, which I think was another really good thing. Like, if someone amongst the group or the church or whatever is the right person, that's fantastic. But, if they're not, you shouldn't like settle, because someone happens to be among. And I just felt like they did such a great job on just looking at all the options all over. And as it turns out, yes, the best man was among us, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, we believe in the providence of God, the sovereignty of God. I could not have anticipated that I would be Ray Ortlund Jr.'s successor. I would have turned it down years before. I had to warm up to the idea. And the Lord orchestrated that whole thing, that I would even end up there. And but it's not as if Immanuel made also an investment in me. So they I suppose, had pity on me, looked at me and saw, okay, this guy's heart's in it. We want to help him. The Lord brought him here. But I didn't come in ready. There's no way I could have pulled off getting my PhD if Immanuel had not co-signed and said, we're going to make this happen for you. So the first 3 years of being on staff, I wasn't really pulling my weight. I was doing the PhD basically half time, really, and getting a kind of survey of the ministry, preaching more and more, getting coached by Ray regularly. They made a huge investment in me, and I couldn't have done it otherwise. I couldn't have come in other words, where I needed to be on my own. It's not like just a matter of timing. I couldn't have actually pulled it off.
Mm-hmm.
So, man, I am so grateful. I think that's the way it's supposed to work.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, I don't think, I'm not trying to chase a rabbit trail here, but I don't think that the seminary church pipeline model we have right now is ideal. I think it works. I think it's wonderful. It's amazing, really. I mean, it took so much work to build out the kind of system we have. But I don't think it's the ideal system. I think the ideal system is when someone is invested in by a congregation, brought up. In other words, they get their education in the kind of middle of the ministry that they're going to serve in.
Mm-hmm.
And Immanuel made that happen for me. So,
yeah, I can see that. And you're just saying that way as opposed to guys being called in the ministry, going to seminary, and then just looking for any church that will hire them.
Yeah,
or call them.
I think it works on some level.
Sure.
Because there's alignment between churches and seminaries. Well, there used to be more than there is now. But you can basically know something about what's coming to you when you call a pastor from this seminary versus that. But every church culture is a little bit different. It's like a personality.
Mm-hmm.
So the ideal thing, I think, is when the seminaries and the churches are basically the same place. And I'm not saying anything controversial. I mean, I think Al Mohler put it pretty sharply a few years ago. I think he said something like, the reason we have seminaries is because churches don't do it, or maybe even won't do it. So I think the best seminaries are kind of working their way out of a job. Because it belongs properly in the church. It's not another sphere of reality, a theological education. It properly belongs in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, not to chase too much of a rabbit trail here, but this is a classical way of thinking. Even Karl Barth, who's on the liberal end of the theological spectrum for some people, even Karl Barth acknowledged the highest form of theology is preaching. And if that's the case, if we're doing the highest form of theology in churches, why wouldn't we be doing the lesser forms of theology, which are, teaching people Greek and Hebrew and systematic theology?
Oh, I see. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
In other words, the church isn't.
Yeah, that is fascinating.
Yeah, the church isn't a sort of step down from good theology
Mm-hmm.
or the serious theology.
Mm-hmm.
The church is where it's happening.
Yeah.
So I that's what I say. I don't think the current arrangement is ideal. However, I am so grateful for our seminaries. I just want to put them in our churches.
Yeah,
That's all I'm saying.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's a fascinating idea. And not that it would happen like that, but it's still, I totally agree with that, because then if you can have someone coming up in the ministry, then you're getting the DNA and the culture and the coaching at that local level. You're still getting the education.
Yeah.
Whether you're using a seminary material or what, you can kind of have the best of both worlds then if you're bringing them up within the church.
Yes.
If you were talking to, and I know you have, and I'm sure you still probably have some of these discussions where other pastors are calling you about transitions, and but if you had a pastor calling you about a transition that they have on their horizon, say 3 years out, like what would be a few of the things that you would say, You just got to make sure, like, there's a few things you got to make sure you do.
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think building in an over communication. You got to make sure you over communicate, and in so doing, you will just be communicating because you're competing with so much noise, and people don't grab onto things quickly. So whatever your timeline is, you probably need to double it if you can. The other thing is there is a corporate consciousness, that we have together. I'm not getting like weird. I mean, we all together are. Every church has a narrative that it's stewarding, and every congregation has intuitions and feelings together. And if the incoming pastor if there's any hint that the incoming pastor and the outgoing pastor in a succession, situation are not on the same page, the church will suffer. The most important thing, maybe, is that can happen is just that the incoming pastor and the outgoing pastor are friends, and that they celebrate one another publicly and often. So Ray and I tried to do that. We were already friends. We had that going for us long before I was even a pastor at Immanuel. Ray was just my hunting buddy. We leased land together and hunted together. So we had something going there, but we decided we're going to make sure everyone knows this is a unified front. Mm-hmm. And here's why that's important. There's a deeply personal relationship between the lead pastor and a congregation. Because when you call a pastor, we don't hire pastors, Immanuel, we try to be really careful with words. They matter so much. You call a pastor to serve God among you. And in so doing, you're actually saying to him, you have permission to speak into my life, to pastor me at the soulish level. In other words, I'm saying, my interiority is not off limits to you. That's what it means that you're my pastor. Now, Jesus is our ultimate pastor, and I'm an under pastor to Christ, but that is my responsibility before God. I'm going to answer to God for that, which of course, again, I love sidebars, which is why it's so devastating and evil when pastors abuse that privilege and that trust when they break it. What has happened, for instance, in the Catholic Church, widespread with abuse. What has happened in Southern Baptist circles with abuse. But it's happening everywhere. It's not limited to one denomination. It's more evil than we know how to put words to. Because the trust is so sacred. And there's a reason that Jesus reserves some of his strongest language for those who cause little ones, innocent ones, to stumble. A millstone hung around your neck and thrown into the sea. It would have been better for you if you had not been born. That kind of language.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that's not just, and so to touch on that, it's not just saying that's not just referencing, say, taking advantage or abusing a child, but you can also put in the category of whether it's a child or an adult, a spiritual, what would you even call it, like a shepherd, a spiritual overseer, or a pastor, or almost a spiritual father in some sense. That's taking that sacred right, that privilege, and authority to some degree, and just using it for their own selfish pleasure. Like that is. What is worse than that? Like that has to be one of the worst things to do.
It's wolfish.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are real wolves in the world, and they don't come out and say, hey, I'm a wolf. In fact, they probably, charitable interpretation, don't even believe themselves to be wolves. And yet, everything about their behavior says this person is out to feed their appetite, and that's the definition of what a wolf does. It's the opposite of what a pastor does. he says, I'm willing to go hungry so long as you get fed. And it's the reason I think that Jesus is so tender in his language with the Apostle Peter in the last conversation they have on this earth, when he tells him not just to feed my sheep, but to feed my lambs, my little ones. And that's how Jesus feels about his church. He's tenderhearted toward them, the way that you feel about your children, the way that I feel about mine. Actually, he feels even more tender toward them. And, just today, my kids were out playing in the backyard, and there were some neighbor kids next door, high school aged. And I knew what was happening in that yard. I'm watching out for my girls. And if even one of those kids had come over to my yard, I would have been out there in a second. Like that kind of instinct of protection is how Jesus feels about his church. And so a pastor stepping in as the under shepherd of Christ, it's as if, you had to go on a long business trip and you said to your brother, I need you to watch over my family. And, if Jesus came to you and said that, if Jesus came to me and said, I need you to watch over Andrew's microphone for the rest of your life, I would consider it a great privilege because Jesus said it to me.
Yep.
But if Jesus said that about his little children, now we see why it's not too much to ask a pastor to give his life in the ministry. And we don't have to ask him that. The Lord's asking him to do that. Now, it maybe raises all kinds of questions about burnout, but the point is there is a sacred relationship between a lead pastor and the church. And when you're handing off that relationship from one lead pastor to another, then everybody needs to know, we're okay with this. They love one another. There's nothing sinister going on here. This lead pastor is going to care for me just like the other lead pastor did. And in our case, and in many cases, it's doubly sensitive if that pastor was the founding pastor. So celebrating one another is actually, you just need to build it into the game plan. It's how you do that, to let everybody know everything's okay. And also, I think one of the wisest things that the elders did, they budgeted for this, is just a raucous party at the end of it, celebrating, not a roast. Don't roast. Words matter. Don't roast your pastor. That's ridiculous. This is outdo one another in showing honor means we don't hide behind jocular put-downs as a way of saying I love you. We just stand right up there in the most manly way possible and say, I love you. Thank you for doing this, 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 and this. And we just, celebrate what the Lord has done there. And we did that, I think, just in glorious fashion. It was great. We had great music. We worshiped the Lord together. And we celebrated Ray and Janny. And I think that momentum and that sort of punctuation mark on his ministry is what enabled Immanuel to turn the corner quickly. Because then nobody's wondering, yeah, but how does Ray feel about it?
Yes.
Does he feel honored? And that's what I'm talking about, corporate consciousness. Everybody then feels, oh, we really did right by Ray. Now we can move on.
Yes, 100%. And that party, do you think, it feels to me like I didn't see this coming, but it feels to me like that kind of transition party, farewell party, whatever you want to call it, for Ray and Janny, the party was for them, but equally it was for us too.
Oh, yeah.
Don't you think it was like, wouldn't you say?
Totally.
We were there to honor them, but there is this comes back to the kind of the corporate consciousness. There was something about kind of just sending them off really well that was satisfying to, I think, the people. Yes. And sort of check that box and allowed it to be somehow final. And I just feel like without that party, the transition wouldn't have felt as satisfying. Yeah. And I know it was their party, but it was like, I just think that's for people looking for like succession or transition things. Like that's something you need to think about, not just for the sake of the people leaving, but for the people who are remaining and looking to welcome and invite the next leader in, if that happens to be a pastor or it's a business or whatever. But like, just properly having a good, proper send-off that feels good. And that party was very well done. It just felt like it really checked that box really well, which I just think is now in hindsight, I just think that's really important. That's an
Yes.
important step.
What I think it highlights a bigger issue, and that is that it is very wise to spend money on fun.
Mm-hmm.
As Ray often said, fun lubricates the gears. So, if you've got to cut something, don't cut the fun out of the budget.
Yeah.
It's what helps people actually stay together feeling good about things. I mean, there's a reason that the rhythms of ancient Israel were punctuated with lots of celebrations and festivals. And I mean, we need those things in our life.
Good point.
So I really believe in fun. And the kind of irony about it is whenever things get tight, like in a 2020 year, we're tempted to go through and say, all right, we got to cut out all the parties. When in actuality, we never needed a party so bad as we need it right now.
That's true. That's a good point.
Yeah.
That's true. I didn't think about using sort of the kind of the ancient or even the Old Testament, the people of Israel with their festivals and things that kind of the Lord built into their cadence. I hadn't thought of that. But a great cadence. I just think of this when you bring up fun. I think of Tom Cox, like one of the older, godly, this guy is, he's a work of art. Tom Cox is from the Lord. How else do you explain that?
Tom Cox is a lot of God's glory packed into one.
Oh, so much. Yeah. And this guy is, he's so theologically astute, and he's a wonderful teacher and speaker. And Tom Cox agitated for fun quite a lot in the elder meetings,
I will never forget Tom Cox making an observation about some kind of a pushback against fun. And it had to do, I think, with like kids or something. And he said something like, don't underestimate the power of dodgeball and a donut.
Yes.
That's the way that wisdom thinks.
Yes.
These things matter. They are not trivial. They matter to God. He invented them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think punctuating our year with lots of celebrations is very wise.
Yeah, I totally agree. How about then if you were talking to another pastor and they have a transition coming up or another leader, what would be some things that we did that you would do differently? Is anything come to mind?
Yeah, there was, there are things that we did that I thought that was the right thing to do that would lean harder into if I could do it again. Having a dedicated web page where all the different communications about the pastoral succession can be seen together. Because if you are planning a long ways out, then there's a lot of communication. And as you mentioned earlier, people are coming in, they're becoming new members. I thought it was very wise that we gave people a heads up. If you join now, in 2 years, we're going to have a different lead pastor. So we don't want you to be surprised.
Mm-hmm.
We want you to buy in.
Mm-hmm.
And, some of the things that Ray did, I wish that I could say that to the outgoing pastor. It usually, several people have called me to ask about pastoral succession, pastors from around the country. And I'm talking to the pastor who's coming in. I would rather talk to the pastor who's going out because he's in a position to do something that the guy coming in is powerless to do. He can't control.
Of course.
Yeah, only the lead pastor can hand the baton off, can hand the authority over, can use all of his leverage. And why wouldn't he do that? To use all of his leverage to make it a home run for the next guy. Now, Ray's been doing that. Actually, one of the first sermons I ever heard Ray preach, he said, I want to hand this church over as a home run for the next guy. And I had no idea I was going to be the next guy. But I thought to myself then, well, of course you do. What else would you want to do?
Mm-hmm.
So Ray did something that was, it humbled me. It put really a weight upon me to make good on his investment. When he stood up before the congregation and said, now, here's how this is going to go. TJ's going to become lead pastor. 99% of things aren't going to change, but 1% of them will. And that 1% is going to feel like 99% to some of you. And when that happens, and you're tempted to get upset about it and to come talk to me, just know I'm on TJ's side.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no doubt. And I remember he actually said to everybody at Immanuel, don't waste this man's life. Don't waste his one precious opportunity to be a lead pastor. So I came in, that's what I stepped into. Now, all of the planning all the communication, all of that was necessary, but that skin in the game that Ray gave, that is really what made the difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think we could have leaned harder in there. I think we could have leaned harder into communication. But I think we should have had a better plan on the back end. We pushed and pushed and pushed to get to that pastoral succession moment in a joyful way, because this is how we plan at Immanuel, and I don't know, maybe it's wrong, but it's what we do. A sideways move, I don't think that's compelling to anybody. If things aren't, if we're not staying a movement, if there's not something of the nature of growth, even if it's not numerical but energy about it, then I don't think that it's compelling to anyone. So we said, okay, Lord, this is how we prayed. We want to get even more momentum during a pastoral succession. We're not looking for a sideways move where nobody leaves. We're looking for more momentum that carries us through the pastoral succession and into the future, because now we're entering generation 2 of Immanuel. So it's like, phase 2 of a company rollout or something. You don't say, all right, let's just keep going like normal.
Yeah.
You say, here we go. We're doubling down, in other words. That spirit carried over in it. And what I didn't anticipate, this is my first blunder as lead pastor, is how exhausted everybody was going to be pushing to that moment, to that party. And then church doesn't stop,
Sure.
It's like, oh, we had this amazing party and,
Yeah.
we're all just like glowing. It's like, okay, so let's plan that service for next week.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we all just, like running on empty.
Yeah.
But the Lord totally lifted us up, because we just didn't even see it.
Yeah.
We didn't even anticipate that.
Yeah.
So I barely had any like sermons scheduled for the year, and so
okay.
I had to drop back and do that.
Well, I was going to say, I wonder if you felt that more than the body. Like I feel like you and the staff probably felt that. I didn't pick up on that.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah,
That's
no,
great.
I really didn't. As just part of the body, or even as an elder. I mean, did you, Andrew? I mean, it just
Not at all.
It felt like it rolled from celebration right in, but I could see on your end that could have been a thing for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like playing fourth quarter and then not realizing you had an overtime coming up.
Yeah, I see. Sure. So what's the recommendation on that? Just make sure as you plan for the next person in line that they're planning ahead as they step in and kind of have some plans in place.
I think it's probably a bit like a presidential election or something. You plan out the first year once
Sure.
you realize, okay, this is going to happen.
Okay. Yeah. That's
You just knock it out.
I can see that. Yeah. All right. Well, I want to shift gears. Anything else on the transition though?
It's probably, just a disclaimer, it's probably different for every church culture.
Mm-hmm.
Immanuel's an elder-led church where the elders have a lot of, they're very respected. And they have a lot of relational equity. So that enabled them to look ahead, maybe in a way that would be more difficult. I could see in a purely congregational led model,
Mm-hmm.
maybe. So it needs to be translated. That's what I'm saying.
And you touched on something, which was that you're getting more calls from the person stepping into the new leadership role than the person leaving that leadership role. And that just an observation. There's just so many things that no one else can do except the person who's leaving that leadership role.
That's right.
You know what I mean? In our case, that was Ray. And there's so many things that only Ray could do to make that transition or succession go really well. If they don't do those things, I'm sure a transition and a succession can happen decently, or it can at least happen. Maybe it can even go, fairly well. But if it's to go great, that person stepping out of that top leadership role, he or she has to do the things that only he or she can do. And there are a few that only he can do. Like I just think of propping up the next person. I mean, Ray
Yes.
was very good at that. And just, it was very clear that Ray is your biggest champion as
That's right.
he moves out as lead pastor and you step in. He's your biggest cheerleader, and
Yes.
he's going to be there. And if someone has an issue, they no longer come to Ray. They come to you now.
That's right.
And he was just real clear. And I just thought that's a must.
It is.
That has to happen.
And if, speaking to the outgoing pastor, if you're the kind of pastor who's going to have a hard time being there positively as the head cheerleader for the next guy when he starts dismantling things that you worked hard on, then you need to find somewhere else to go.
Mm-hmm.
And invest him with all of your goodwill and authority that you can, so that he doesn't have to spend years earning it. He's going to have to do some of that anyway. And give the church a kiss on the cheek on the way out the door.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody feels good about that.
Yes.
If you can be the head cheerleader for the next guy and not be a problem for him,
Mm-hmm.
if you're committed to that, if you know that, if you have those understandings, then a new, I think, era of ministry opens up for you. You become, kind of like the local bishop.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can really invest your time in the next generation quietly behind the scenes. And you have to figure out how to navigate that relationship with the new lead pastor. You need to make sure he's okay with it. I had been preaching to Ray for 3 or 4 years, so it wasn't weird for me to be preaching with Ray in the room. I got used to that years ahead of time. And we have our friendship. We still hunt together, but we
Mhm.
also have very structured ministry relationship. We meet once a month, and I can ask him anything, he can ask me anything, and that arrangement really works for us. But I really I need Ray's counsel. I need to see my ministry through his eyes. It's so hard to be the lead pastor because you can't see yourself anymore. You're out there running in the front. And having another lead pastor who understands, or former lead pastor who understands what you're after, like what the church is reaching for, and can help you see yourself, that is just, man, it's worth his weight in gold.
Mm-hmm.
So Ray actually, people don't know, but he might actually be serving Immanuel more now than he ever has, but it's all behind the scenes. He's, with Barnabas Piper coming on recently, Ray had a big hand in that, helping Barnabas to his ordination exam. So I think a lead pastor who is entering that phase of their ministry, that sort of home stretch, has that opportunity, but it just has to be navigated carefully, because I know of places where it's not going well because the lead pastor never actually divested himself of that authority. Mm-hmm. So if you can't do that, on behalf of the guy that's coming in, I would say just find somewhere else to go.
Yeah. Yep. I totally agree. All right. So you recently as in, it was 19, I believe, you completed your PhD.
Yes.
So you were actually Reverend Dr. T.J. Timms.
Yeah, it's true.
We call you TJ, but
I feel like you got to have a robe on when you
go
by that time.
I don't disagree. Which, congratulations yet again on your PhD. I mean, they don't give those out to just anyone, like Ray has said before, and I totally agree. That's quite an accomplishment. And so you had your PhD was with University of Aberdeen,
That's right.
Scotland?
In Scotland.
And remind me again your master's?
King's College in London.
Yeah, okay.
So from
All right.
London to Scotland.
Yes, okay.
Moving up.
Yep. I love it. By the way, is there like any further education you could do? I mean, I assume there is always, but
they call
what would that be?
PhD a terminal degree, because either it terminates your education or it terminates you.
Okay.
But you could always do another one. And
at that point, it's just more PhDs.
Yeah, well, you could do another doctorate degree, or you could do an undergraduate degree in some different field. Some people do that.
I see.
In the world of academia, the more you stack on credentials for specializations, the better.
Sure.
And I toyed around with the idea of doing something somewhere else, and Jessica gave me that look like, you can do it, but you'll be doing it alone, pal.
Okay. Well, it's probably best to pay attention to that for now. But that is quite a feat. If someone's going to do a PhD, which like similar to what you went through, they're going to have to just prepare to do a lot of hard work, a lot of study, a lot of diligence, a lot of persistence. You're going to want to give up multiple times. You need to keep pushing through, right? I mean, this is not easy stuff. And a big sort of centerpiece or capstone of this entire thing is a thesis, correct? Like that's quite a lot of study and time into writing and all of this. Like that's sort of that's the big thing, right? And how many, so you did your thesis, which is what I'm coming around to, what I want to talk about is Plausibility Structures in the New Commandment.
Yes.
Is that what it was titled?
Yeah,
or similar?
Something like that. I can't remember the exact title, honestly, because it was negotiated there at the end.
Oh, yeah?
My
Okay.
supervisor. But Plausibility Structures Theory in the New Commandment. I think it was a reparative conversation between Peter Berger's Plausibility Structures Theory and the New Commandment in John 13, 34 and 35.
Okay.
Yeah, so the title itself like barely fits on the front of a book. I think.
Yep. And
Stupid.
so is that something that you were working on since you started your PhD studies, or the second half? Like, when did you start to work on this big thesis, and how many words does it need to be, or was it?
Well, it was 100,000 words, but that's actually the difficult part, is narrowing it down to 100,000 words. You have to keep it brief. You know, there are some. Yeah, I heard Alistair McGrath, the historical theologian and one of the most published men in Irish history, say, "Don't complain about," or where he said this to a group of us in our master's degree. He said, "Don't complain to me about that 3,000, 3,000 word count until you've written a 400,000 word thesis." And I thought, holy cow, that's out there. So that set the expectation. 100,000, I see what he means now. It's hard. You have to be really disciplined. And I think the thesis word count has come down because professors just don't have as much time to read.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So,
it used to be 400,000?
Well, I think it has trended toward 100,000 from, depending on what it was in.
I see.
Yeah. But most universities now have 100,000.
Okay.
Or thereabouts.
When in your PhD study did you kind of settle on this is what your thesis is going to be?
Man, I had a real leg up going into this thing because I had a lot of time to think about it ahead of time. And so when I submitted a proposal to, basically in the PhD, you are aligning with a supervisor at a university who has expertise in the field that you want to be in. So I pitched an idea to Professor Tom Greggs at the University of Aberdeen, who is, I think, one of the smartest men alive, and certainly one of the smartest systematic theologians that I've ever been around. And a dear man, too. I felt Tom was supervising me and also, in a sense, shepherding me along. Because, I remember I listened to the podcast you did with David Filson, who's a friend of mine. And David described it well. The rigor of it is you're in your head all the time, and it can be depressing. It can actually, it leads to a lot of depression. And so most good universities actually have they've thought about that, and they help students through that time. So Tom was a wonderful supervisor to work with. And from the very beginning, the idea I pitched to him, he latched onto. So I was able out of the gate to not have to change my ideas too much and to get to the thesis. The thesis is both the whole dissertation, and the thesis is both a few sentences that describe the dissertation. You can use the word both ways. So the thesis I submitted, the few words, was pretty near to what I actually did. And again, Kent, God is just ridiculously kind to me and has helped me, because even before I submitted the idea, I had Ray Ortlund to bounce it off of, so I went into that knowing, okay, there's at least something here. And it was Ray. I don't even know if Ray remembers this, because I was always picking his brain about something and I think annoying him half the time. But when when your office is next to like a walking theological dictionary, you just take advantage of it. And I asked him early on, I was looking for a way to talk about gospel culture in, sort of at street level language, or not necessarily street level as much as just tangible language. And that's really difficult. It's really difficult to put culture into objective language and then to try to describe it and to try to put it into a science, or an ordered way of thinking is really difficult. And to do that, you have to get into the realm of sociology. But as soon as you do, you find that the realm of sociology and theology don't play well together in the academy. One, I think, pretty notable exception is Peter Berger. Peter Berger died in 2016, I think, or 17. And he had a great career as a sociologist. Taught, I think, he was in Chicago most of his life. I can't remember what all universities he taught at, but he was a wonderful writer and coined an idea, a theory, in his 2014 book, The Many Altars of Modernity. He highlights the idea as one of his crowning achievements, and that's what turned me on to it. So Ray introduced me to Peter Berger, but Peter Berger, in reading Berger, alerted me to what he thought his big idea was, which was plausibility structure. He says, I coined it. He says, if they open me up after I die, they'll find it engraved on my heart. And so I didn't have to read it much further to know, okay, this is what Peter Berger thinks is his big idea. Let me dig into it. So that's how plausibility structures theory, it was my vehicle for talking about gospel culture. In other words, describing what is gospel culture. Now, I don't think I ever used the word gospel culture in the dissertation because that's sort of insider Immanuel language, but that's basically what I was talking about. And I chose John 13:34 and 35, the new commandment passage. By this all men will know you're my disciples, by the love that you have for one another. And so that's the command. And right before that, Jesus says, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another. So it's theologically appealing because Jesus just said he gave a new command. And that in and of itself can be kind of problematic, like a new command. Wait a minute. So it was interesting, and it was two verses that encapsulated gospel culture. I mean, it's hard to put it in a nutshell better than, here's the commandment: love each other the way that I have loved you. So he's appealing to their memory, their shared experience together. And by this, all people, I mean, that's the word there, everyone will know that you're my disciple. So here's the distinguishing mark of a true Christian disciple: the Christ-like love among them. That's what Jesus said is the defining mark. He did not say, by this, all people will know you're my disciple, by your, wonderful orthodoxy of doctrine. But it's their orthodoxy of culture, their Christ-like culture. In other words, he was expecting that people are going to be watching you, and they will be able to see your love. They'll be able, in looking at your love, they will think, that looks like Jesus. And so that is basically gospel culture. Mm-hmm. And Peter Berger gave me a way to describe culture at the granular level through his plausibility structures theory.
All right. Can you define plausibility structures for us, and then just touch on a little bit more on Peter Berger? I don't know much there.
I can't. Do we take bathroom breaks in this?
We can absolutely take a bathroom break. Go for it. You remember where it's at?
Yeah, I do.
All right, back left corner.
All right.
Hit it.
This coffee's great.
Andrew, if we keep the conversation going, we don't have to do any edits. What do we want to talk about?
Well, what do you think plausible structure, the definition of that is?
Plausibility structure,
Yeah.
It is, so I looked it up, I think last year when he finished his thesis, and it is something to do with like the why something works and like why it works and how it works. Like it's like some ideas are great, but they're not plausible. You know what I mean? Like It's a great idea, but it doesn't work in real life. Mm-hmm. Is my definition close? Did you pull it up on Wikipedia?
I was about to, yeah. Let's find out. I'm typing with one hand right now.
because like you've heard like if something's plausible, you know what I mean? It's like that's not. We don't really speak in that language, but it's like that's not doable. It's not feasible. It's just not really going to work. But where it gets more complex is like a structure. What's a plausibility structure?
In sociology, and especially the sociological study of religion, plausibility structures are the socio-cultural contexts for systems of meaning within which these meanings make sense or are made plausible. So to take that down a bit, I would say this works. Why does it work? How does it work?
Yeah. Okay.
What makes this work?
Can you read that again a little slower?
Sure thing. In sociology, and especially the sociological study of religion, plausibility structures are the socio-cultural contexts for systems of meaning within which these meanings make sense or are made plausible.
Gotcha. Maybe TJ can help us understand that. We were Googling plausibility structures. I think that's where we're at, right? I was asking you about
Yes.
if you could define plausibility structure for us, and then also if we could hear a little bit more about Peter Berger.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, nobody. Usually when this conversation comes up, it's when Jessica starts giving me the elbow, like, do not talk about because this is how I end conversations.
Yeah. Great. Okay, this is perfect then. This is actually perfect because Jessica's not here. We're asking about it, so like just full bore, man. Yes. Just go for it.
Yeah. Well, a plausibility structure is the social environment. This is Berger's definition, in which any cognitive or normative definition of reality is plausible. Here's what that means: the social setting, the culture. In which a cognitive definition is simply a one that we're aware of. So, the Apostles' Creed, that's a cognitive definition of reality around which we build cultures. A normative definition are just the ones we assume. They become normative. We might not even be aware of them. Things like, I don't know. They're what Tim Keller calls baseline cultural narratives. And there are things like, God helps those who help themselves. Somehow that's kind of deep down in the DNA of Americans. But the difference between, culture at large and a plausibility structure is a more cohesive, smaller unit in which an idea feels plausible. So that's what Berger's talking about. The social environment in which any cognitive or normative definition of reality is plausible is it points to the fact that what we believe cannot be felt to be plausible, believed to be plausible, unless it's embodied in a social environment. So, for instance, it would have been nearly impossible to be a Reformed Christian, a Protestant Christian, living in, late 16th century Spain, because the whole social environment was Roman Catholic. So you couldn't, even if you believed Luther's ideas, you couldn't feel them to be true because they couldn't be embodied anywhere. There are many other examples. Maybe another great example that we all understand, but none of us wants to identify with, is an occult. There's a reason that occults tend, we're talking about the weirdest ones, the ones that try to get people to literally drink the Kool-Aid. There's a reason that those are always out in like compounds in places. You need to be able to control the social environment in order for the definition of reality to be maintained, in order for it to be believable, to be felt to be real. Mm-hmm. So the world is literally filled with plausibility structures. And so Berger all he's doing as a sociologist, he stands in the school of what's called the sociology of knowledge. So there's all kinds of sociology. Sociology of knowledge, I think, emerged from Emil Durkheim sort of in the early 19th century. And Durkheim really sort of built out the school. It became its own way of thinking, separate from other kinds of sociology. We do sociology all the time, especially around election time, to try to figure out what types of people are going to vote which way. Sociologists are really helpful, but what they do is basically the science of socialization. They look at people and they notice trends. In other words, it's almost entirely a science of observation. Now, without getting too deep into the weeds, it is value laden. As much as every sociologist will want to tell you it's not, all we're doing is just reporting the facts. It is value laden. And Berger actually goes a long way in describing how even the field of sociology has itself a culture or a plausibility structure of sociology. So plausibility structure is just noticing that you can't believe something's true if it can't be embodied in a social reality. Or another way to put it, everything that's true has a placeholder in socialization or in a social context.
Wow, that's a big thought.
It's massive. It's absolutely, and you see now why Berger thought plausibility structures. Those two words, plausibility structure. He thought that was his grand discovery, and it wasn't that no one else had discovered that, but Berger packaged it concisely and worked it out in all kinds of ways, so that people on the street, I mean, he one of the reasons that we're talking about Peter Berger right now is because he's just a wonderful author. He knew how, he had a rare genius. He could translate complicated ideas into uneducated language. And that really is, I think, one of the definitions of genius. Not being able to think big thoughts, but being able to take big thoughts and put them into simple forms. I mean, I just don't believe a person's a genius if they can't explain it to me in a way my grandmother can understand. As C.S. Lewis said, the test of having understood your own meaning is the ability to translate it into uneducated language. And Berger did that with plausibility structures theory, which is why he really appealed to me. Because I had no background in sociology. I had to learn it all from the ground up. And Berger helped me to do that. And those two words, plausibility structure, encapsulate something foundational about reality. Whatever it is we're preaching. Now, so I'm translating it now into Christian language. If what we're preaching cannot be seen in the way we're living together, then nobody inside of that social environment will be able to really believe what we're preaching. Because part of the way that we actually feel things to be true is that they're embodied. They're socialized. Mm-hmm. And that's true no matter what we're talking about. Any ideology you can name. And it explains, doesn't it, why so many Christians are walking around not feeling like what they believe really isn't that true. Because it's not really being embodied. It also explains why so many people feel their faith to be so real, even though they're not very good at explaining it. In other words, the cognitive definition that they have in their head is really unformed, but they're grabbing onto it. Their sense of its truthfulness is being, in other words, the stream of truth is more than cognitive. It's experienced. It's more than doctrine, in other words. It's experienced through the culture. And that's actually a very powerful form of persuasion. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of kind of trite things we could bring in here, the sayings, but it really does ring true. And people don't care so much what you say as what you actually do. I mean, what you do is speaking. Culture is speaking. It's a powerful apologetic even. So that I am talking to Kent Lapp, and you might say a lot of things that I disagree with. Let's say we are just at odds about things. But over time, watching you live out what you say you believe is going to speak louder to me than than your arguments. In other words, you are an argument because it's an argument I can't invalidate. I can't say, you're cut from the same bolt of cloth I am. You love your family like I do. All these things. And that when a whole bunch of people do that together in a gospel culture, it becomes very powerful. Yes. So anyway, I'm getting the cart ahead of the horse.
No, that's great, man. Thanks for diving right in. That it's starting to click, and my goodness, there's a lot here to mine. I was trying to think of an example of like something where someone believes a certain thing, or maybe has written a book, or has a kind of a pet saying, or is trying to get some sort of a way of thinking out in the world and just sort of falls flat because it's just not plausible. Yeah. Do you have any examples? Not that we want to bring up a bad example for someone, but They have to exist, right? I mean, there's
Yeah.
people with these big ideas all over the place, and most of them are going to fall flat because it's just kind of created in the magic of their mind.
That's
And
right.
it's some great idea. It's just not how the human race works. It's just not that plausible, and it's just going to fall flat. I mean, they might sell a few books or whatnot, but that's what I'm picking up on is there, if this is something, it's like, well, you want to do this in a way that it works. And I'm sure there's people that are doing some things in a way that doesn't work, and their thoughts are just sort of falling flat because it's not plausible.
Yeah, that's right. If you have to push these things to the extremes to make them obvious. But if you started a wave of, I don't know, knowledge that said everyone at the age of 125 will grow wings and fly, then all you need is just a few people turning 125 to invalidate that claim.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, that's a really dumb and extreme example. But if you're making claims about reality that don't actually prove true in actuality,
Mm-hmm.
eventually what happens is people say, well, the claims aren't true.
Yes.
So, but it works in the other way. If you're not even making very loud claims, if you're just saying things like Jesus can actually change your very desires, and you have a community that proves that, people will search you out for that. That news will travel. And a great example of that is Francis Schaeffer's L'Abri, the shelter. Schaeffer started L'Abri as a kind of, a shelter from what some of his church experience had been. A place where, in his words, honest answers to honest questions. You could come there with your questions. People showed up from around the world, drug addicts, all kinds of people with questions, searching after God. And they were allowed to live there with the Schaeffers. They were, a little commune, and it sounds weird, but it wasn't weird. It was just honest. And that, it's still going today, long after Schaeffers died. And many people from, people you wouldn't expect, from college professors to business owners. Carl Ellis, for instance, the great Black theologian of our time, were influenced by that culture. It spoke loudly because what he was preaching and saying was actually being embodied in what they were doing. So yeah, there's all kinds of examples now. That the thing is, this is a long game thing. You can't judge it. Usually, it's not easy to judge right out of the gate. So there are things like, I don't have a dog in this fight. Didn't even read the book. I just know a lot of people who did. The what is it, like the 5-hour work week or something like that?
4-hour work week.
Yeah, whatever it is. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, which I've been doing that for ages. Worked out fine for me. Not really.
Yeah, not really.
I'll do the opposite.
Yeah.
That is, I suppose, creating. I suppose there are plausibility structures businesses maybe where people are working that out, and it takes time to know, does it work?
Yes.
But a plausibility structure is really, it's really more robust than that. It's not just like a business culture. It can be depending on the business, but it really is people defining reality together. And so it's tricky to know when you're looking at a plausibility structure. Does that make sense?
Yep. It does. I have something to submit for your consideration.
Yeah.
If when we think about plausibility structures that don't work, what do you think about this? My wife's mom and dad are Amish. I love them both dearly. They are wonderful people, and they raised excellent family. And my wife's fantastic, and I hope that Papa and Mom never leave the Amish.
Yes.
Genuinely, they're awesome. The question is if that structure is plausible for certain outcomes. And here's what I'm getting at. If you want to live the Amish life, the Amish tradition and culture and everything like that, so that you can have certain friends and live in a certain type of community and have a certain type of social life and not be involved with other certain types of events and activities and cultures and so forth, and and just sort of have a self-perpetuating, almost throwback to the 40s in some ways, or the 30s even. Like, if that's the goal, I think it's plausible. If the goal is a vibrant and okay, so now it just gets tricky, because if the goal is actually a change of heart and hearts on fire for Christ, I'm not sure. Now at this point, I'm not so sure it's plausible, because what we're doing is we're taking roles of men, which in my opinion, it's not for me, and you know that, like, that's not for me, but it's probably
when I saw the bourbon scene.
Right. It's probably for some people, right? I don't have a problem. I hope there's Amish people listening to this right now. It wouldn't be out of the realm of considered possibility.
Yes.
So I don't have a problem with that. I like, to be honest with you.
Oh, me too.
I get those people. You know what I mean? Like, I grew up Mennonite, but there's something even still beyond that. They're just like very down to earth, fun loving, kind of entrepreneurial, scrappy. Like, like
so much to admire.
So much to admire. I like being around them, and that's not that. That's just the straight truth. But if the goal is changed hearts, okay, I'm not sure that a lot of church roles is very plausible for that.
Yeah.
Be curious to hear what you think. And I'll just say one other thing. This is a working theory. I don't have stats on it, but I'll just call it for what I see it right now. It seems to me, and within the Amish circles, but certainly, like, well, this is true for almost any, I think, kind of culture, tradition, but you have this spectrum. And let's just take the Amish, for example, because that's what we're talking about. You have my wife's parents, who are kind of on the, I don't know, we could call it like almost like the side of this Amish spectrum that's closest to like the common people or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have, like, let's just call it like a very kind of hardcore or conservative or even backwoods, like taking things to a whole different level. Okay.
Yes.
Still Amish, but they're different spectrum entirely. On this spectrum over here, the very conservative, hardcore, kind of backwoods, if you want to call it, it seems to me that when it comes to perverted activities and sexual abuse, it's the more conservative, the more hardcore you get, the more common that type of thing happens.
Wow.
Which, again, I don't have hard stats on this. It's just, it seems to me that there's something here. So I'd submit it for consideration. But this is my case study for, but why would that be? Because over here you have the most rules, the most hardcore everything. Yeah. Why aren't you getting the activity, or why aren't you getting outcomes you're enforcing so heavily?
Yeah.
It's actually like the opposite is true.
Yes.
So would this be, I'm not trying to offend anyone, but like, would this be an example of it's a great plausible structure for certain outcomes?
Yes.
It's not a plausible structure for a spiritual outcome.
Yes. And so here's a couple of things. One, this is part of what I did in my dissertation, was to show that I love Berger's plausibility structures theory for its clarity. And I never got a chance to have a conversation with Peter Berger. I wish I had.
Is he still alive?
No, he died while I was writing this thing.
Oh, wow.
I was actually trying to get in touch with him, to meet with him whenever he died. And I don't know how he would respond to what I'm going to say. I don't know, in other words, if he would consider this an affront to his plausibility structures theory, but I felt it was inadequate for use, at least by Christians. And Berger himself was Lutheran, because it doesn't take into account the primary ingredient of socialization, which is God himself. In other words, God doesn't factor into the social equation in plausibility structures theory. Mm-hmm. So what I was trying to do was to build it out, because in John 13, 34, and 35, there's someone else present, namely God himself. He's creating the social environment. So what I didn't want to do is basically to say that, and so here I'm coming around to your point. Just because you can embody, you have this doctrine, whatever it is. It could be Muslim doctrine, Hindu doctrine, whatever it is. Just because you have the doctrine and you have a society to embody that doctrine doesn't mean that you're actually going to be able to do it. You need something else. And that's one of the ways that we know, is it true or isn't? can it actually be lived out? Now, obviously, there are failures even in the New Testament for the apostles to embody what they were preaching. But in those cases, God himself disciplined them. And so my point is, we have to factor God into the equation for this thing to even work. Now, I've never done this before, but we can do it right on the spot. We could run the Amish through a plausibility structures theory. So what I did that I think is a unique contribution to knowledge, because that's what everybody writing a PhD is trying to do, is I read all of Peter Berger's works carefully in chronological order, developing the theme of plausibility structure. In other words, discovering it as Berger himself seemed to discover it over nearly a 50-year writing career. And it was a wonderful exercise. I'm so glad I did it. And one of the things that emerged was there are at least 5 things that make up a plausibility structure in the modern world, because this isn't, 16th century Spain. We live in a pluralist society, which means that holding a deeply held beliefs are always being challenged just by the presence of my neighbors who don't believe what I believe. So how do we think about plausibility structures in the environment we're in right now? Several things. There are basically 5 characteristics of a plausibility structure. I'll name them quickly, then talk about the ones that matter. But we can think about the Amish through this lens, and I think I've never done this. This will be fascinating. Anomie. In other words, it comes from it's a word that Emil Durkheim kind of made famous in relation to suicide. Anomie is it comes from the Greek word anamos. So nomos meaning law or rule or order. The prefix makes it the opposite. So an absence of order. Every plausibility structure has to have an answer for the anomie, or the sense of lawlessness or chaos that we feel without some way of making sense of things. Everybody's looking for a way to not spiral down into meaninglessness. And they have some kind of belief, some kind of way of rationalizing why something means something. In other words, nobody really buys into meaninglessness for long. We can't live with ourselves like that. The other one is, so that's one mark. The other one is dialectics. Now, this was made famous. It has a history in philosophy. It's probably one of the most complicated words to define. If you look it up in dictionaries, you'll get all kinds of answers. But basically what it means is a conversation. We all have to have a way of making sense of reality through conversation. Now that's all means all kinds of things. Interestingly, one of the things it probably doesn't mean is social media. D.C. Schindler, the Catholic theologian, recently published an article entitled "Why Social Media is Hate Speech," and he helped explain. I'd been musing on this for a while. He helped me understand why it is social media actually doesn't help build plausibility structures at all. Because it's not actually a dialogue, it's a monologue. He goes so far as to say it's a lot of hate speech. Maybe not all of it, obviously, because Ray Ortlund's on Twitter and it's pretty great. Yeah. But so much of it, in other words, is not both of us standing next to one another in dialogue, looking at the truth and trying to understand it better, but me just trying to get what's in my head into your head. So that's the opposite of a plausibility structure. A plausibility structure has dialectic about it. And that happens in all kinds of ways. The third one is legitimation. We need rituals. We need rites of passage. We're physical. We need things that actually correspond to what we say we believe. So, how crazy would it be to say, we believe in patriotism, but not have a way for people to become citizens? We have legitimations. We have ways for people to do that. Just recently, I was at the voting booth, and there was a first-time voter, and the person running the voting poll station or whatever said, "All right, everybody clap your hands for the first-time voter." Now, what that person didn't realize was they were reinforcing that was a legitimation for that young girl who was her first time to vote. What was happening in that moment is she was being inaugurated into, this democratic society that we have, or whatever you want to call it. So we need legitimations. The other one, though, is there's a difference there's a fundamental difference in kinds of plausibility structures. There's some that are myth-based, Berger shows us, and some that are just purely institutional-based. There's no actual, I mean, he demonstrates it. It's the difference between capitalism and socialism. No one actually dies for capitalism. Now, we like capitalism because it's a negotiated arrangement to keep us from tearing one another apart, to pursue sometimes a common interest, but mostly personal interest. Nothing wrong with that. I think I'm a fan. I think it works. Socialism, however, you kill for socialism because it's a myth. And I don't mean a myth as in it's not true. I'm not using the word in that sense, but I mean it has an ideology behind it. There's a reason that it's easy to rally people to war in a socialist country because it's for the people. It's this sense of continuity. Basically, a socialist country is a giant plausibility structure. It's really hard to pull off. It's reason it never really works well because we really lost the capacity to have that kind of a society when we could start talking to one another. So socialism's really hard to pull off today for that reason. But that is a distinction between kinds of plausibility structures. There's some that explains why some are strong and some are weak. Now, if you put all these together, this is how you get a really strong plausibility structure.
What was the fifth one though?
So anomy, legitimation, dialectics, myth versus institution, and competition. Now,
okay.
Competition is, if we were having this conversation 200 years ago, we might not even identify this one as an aspect of a plausibility structure. But every modern plausibility structure, one of the reasons that some are strong and some are weak is because some have answers for their opponent's beliefs and some don't. The ones that do are strong.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so if you take any, if we just take the two flagships, right? We're on track now, recent information I heard. Rebecca McLaughlin, I think, points this out in her book, Confronting Christianity, which is a great book. We're on track for Christianity and Islam to be about 20% of the world will be Christian, about 20% will be Islam, I think by the year 2040 or something, the way things are trending. Christianity is still bigger, still trending bigger, but the middle is kind of going away. And Christianity and Islam are the two flagships. If you take both of those religions, both of them, of course, have doctrine. But one of the reasons that both of them are growing is that they both have answers for the other sides. In other words, there are as many Islamic apologists, probably, as there are Christian apologists. And Abdu Murray with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, who's a great Christian apologist, started out as a Muslim apologist.
Yes.
I mean, so having answers for your opponent's views is a uniquely modern thing. You must have answers for your opponent's views. So you put all five of those things together. If you have a social environment that has a way to actually talk to one another about how to make sense of the world, anomy, with rituals built in, and the Lord Jesus himself gave us those. So plausibility structure isn't a modern invention. This is how reality works. And if there's if the plausibility structure itself is making sense of reality at the level of the cosmic, of life beyond this life. So it is mythic in that it's not just located in the institutions. And if it has an answer for its opponent's views, that environment that's an environment that you can grow in and feel your beliefs to be true in. And it explains why Peter Berger thought actually most churches are not asking enough of people. The reason people are departing from churches, Berger said, is not because modernity is so compelling, not because secularism is so compelling. Secularism is not that compelling. It doesn't have good answers. It's not well thought out. It's because churches have actually moved away from being a plausibility structure. They've moved towards Sunday morning events once a week, which is not a way to actually reinforce beliefs. So if we run the Amish through this lens, right? They're really strong on some fronts.
Mm-hmm.
You know, probably legitimations. I don't know. I mean, you would have to tell me about dialectics, but it seems to me one of the points they're really maybe weak on is competition.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, actually,
Yeah, I think so.
yeah. So you
Yep.
you leave. I don't know. I'm just having conversations with you and other people. I mean,
Yep.
you get outside of that community and discover, yeah, not everybody in the world is like crazy. You know?
Sure.
You know,
Yeah, that's
so-
right. Yeah. Yeah. If I run the Amish through that filter, so the enemy, this is the way of having meaning, the dialects, there's definitely like they have their thoughts that are converse and legitimation. The myth versus institution is an interesting one. And then, yeah, I think the competition. Oh, yeah, I think that's probably they're probably a little weak there. Probably a little weak there because, and I think that's why it's getting better now, but this still exists, and it's why they don't want their people having interactions with other people,
Yeah.
or having Bible studies that aren't kind of censored or whatever, or kind of because then you can start to kind of get out and start talking with other people and realize there's other good ideas out there too. There's other ways of doing things, and now you've lost it.
Yes.
But you made the comment earlier about a plausibility structure in terms of a cult. That's a fascinating example, because if you take your average cult and spread them out over a few states, and no one lives even the same state, but you each live at least 15 minutes from each other, 15, 20 minutes, that cult probably goes away very, very quickly, because you have your individuals kind of living out just randomly, in the world, and you can't do the things that you need to do on a routine daily basis physically, just
That's right.
whatever that is, coming together and having meetings and discussions and living your life out in a certain way. If you can't do that, it's no longer plausible, right?
That's
but
right.
if you can get people into a compound and you can control, getting up and how we do breakfast and how we have meetings and your work for the day, and now you can start to really shift kind of their attitudes. Not just you're shifting their actions, now you're shifting their attitudes and beliefs, and now you can start to kind of pump their head full of kind of whatever you want, as long as it has. You start out with it being reasonable, and then they start to accept that, and next thing they are drinking the actual Kool-Aid. But if you can get them together, now that's plausible, right?
That's right.
But without that,
Yeah.
it doesn't work.
Because we're navigating reality at those two levels, not just how we define reality, but how we experience it is how we define it. So it's one of the reasons that I think the Christian church there's nothing like it. It's not, I can't just walk into Mecca and go and pray in that mosque. There's a serious barrier to entry there. The Apostle Paul, in his letters to the Corinthian church, actually assumes there will be outsiders watching you. They'll be there in your service watching what you're doing. So, don't speak in tongues so often, because you're weirding them out, and they don't know what to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is a major difference between the plausibility structure that is the church and like in a cult. So whenever people call Christianity a cult, I just think, are you kidding me? Like, we're actually saying to the world, come, look at what we're doing. We'll talk to you about it. We're saying to our own people, hey, don't work out at the church gym. Go work out at that other gym and talk to people. I mean, we're the exact opposite of that. We are actually open. We're an open plausibility structure. And I maybe one of the reasons that some churches are just not thriving right now is because they have kind of taken that cultish mentality. Don't associate with those people. Where do you ever see that in the New Testament? The only people the Apostle Paul tells us not to associate with are those people who claim to be Christians, and they just, they're here to do damage to the church. And in that sense, it's just actually a way we can love them. We're not going to let you live like a hypocrite among us. But when it comes to people who don't believe us, who think we're crazy for the ideas that we hold, we love talking to one another. That's why we're here.
Yes.
That's why the Lord has left us here with this mission to do.
Yes.
So I think one of the ways that churches, that plausibility structures theory can help churches today, and that's helping Immanuel Church, is by just noticing that what the culture that we're building together is as important as the doctrine that we're holding together, because they're actually one and the same. They're coming together. If we say we really believe in loving, I don't know, our neighbors, but we don't actually do anything to love our neighbors, we won't even be able to believe ourselves.
Yes.
That's what plausibility structures theory. That's the soundbite of plausibility structures theory.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think too that's man, well that last one there, that's really, if we say we love our neighbor but then don't ever do anything to love our neighbor, eventually we're going to lose that belief altogether.
Yeah. And can I just say, when it comes to the Amish, one of the most compelling things that I think the Amish community ever did was whenever their children were killed in that school shooting, and they came out publicly and said, "We are not going to retaliate."
Mm-hmm.
They loved and prayed for the very person that killed them.
Yes.
That was a great example of beliefs being embodied in a community in a way that all the world could see. And I think that was a shining moment.
Yes, I totally agree. And another great example of the Amish in kind of a case for the plausibility of their structure is another good example is like being sued or suing in business. They don't do that.
Yeah.
And so in some regard, they can be easy to take advantage of. And yet it's not that they wouldn't put up a defense, but that's a very practical outcome of what they believe. They won't do that. But it strikes me, back to the plausibility structure, it strikes me that then this idea of a plausibility structure basically does violence to this cultural kind of ho-hum, surfacey Christianity that has no change of heart. It has no depth.
Yeah.
It has no appreciation for the beauty of Christ and his drawing power in changing lives. It's just, you go to church, you look good, you put your best foot forward, you make people believe you're better than you really are. You don't let them see your weaknesses. You certainly don't let them see your sins. You try to be kind of as impressive and yet normative as possible. And that whole thing, though, the plausibility structure is basically saying, go ahead, it's just not going to work.
Yeah.
Because you're not, when you're just checking the box for Christianity and not actually living or believing as a Christian, well, there's this disconnect between your actions and your heart, right? And if you do that long enough, you won't start to believe it yourself. And now you really are just going through the motions. Like, it's just this idea that the concept of a plausibility structure, applying that on kind of cultural, surfacey Christianity, it's sort of condemning of that.
Yeah, it totally is. It explains why it's not that kind of Christianity is not something we're willing to die for, because it's not our real plausibility structure. It's an aspect of our plausibility structure which is located somewhere else, in friend groups, in I don't know, maybe in some other club or something that we're a part of. Maybe it's a country club. We're actually navigating reality from that place. That's our real plausibility structure.
Yes.
And what the church is just sort of icing on top. It's an aspect of this plausibility structure that we're a part of. So we still hang out with people who maybe go to our church or go to other churches, similar churches or whatever. But that's really the place where we're working out reality together.
Yes.
And so most churches, I shouldn't say that. Many churches are not actually plausibility structures. They're events that happen once or twice a week. To have a plausibility structure, you are creating a world inside of which we live together. And that's pretty rare.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it probably explains a lot of the surprise that people felt that so many evangelicals seem to just abandon their Christianity for politics this last season. They didn't really. They weren't really doing anything that they hadn't been doing before. In other words, they didn't have to leave their plausibility structure. They are not actually living inside of a Christian community. They're living inside of other kinds of communities that call themselves Christian, but that's the plausibility structure they live inside of is not actually the plausibility structure of the church as God sees it. It's not where God himself dwells.
Mm-hmm.
This is what sets apart a Christian church.
Mm-hmm.
It's where God dwells. So the form of reality in the room when Christians are together before the Lord, open to him. So we're talking about something that can't be seen on the surface at first. It's in the heart. A Christian plausibility structure is simply what a community looks like whenever the Spirit of Christ is in the room. How do we orient to one another when we know Jesus is there, when we really believe that, when he actually is there? So that's what we're striving for at Immanuel. I walk in on the Sunday morning and I think, how would I speak to this person if Jesus were standing right here? Because that's what the Bible says is actually happening right now. He's here. He's in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm living this moment in reference to him. And because he's here, I speak to you honorably,
Mm-hmm.
Romans 12:10. I speak to you gently, Matthew 11:29. I speak to you honestly,
Mm-hmm.
1 John 1:7. I mean, the form of reality in the room changes when Jesus is there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a Christian plausibility structure. And we don't have to be John Lennox's and Oz Guinness's and Ravi Zacharias's, and these great defenders of the faith and preachers. We don't have to be great, defenders of the faith to be a compelling community for Jesus in the world that actually moves the needle. As a matter of fact, I think we're living in, I'm not going to get too much into this, but we're proving this to be true in the world. All the great teaching and thinking and defending is no substitute for an actual community where it's being lived out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's one of the reasons there are many people abandoning secularism and that whole idea where I determine my sexual identity, my identity period. That world does not build, plausibility structures inside which I can live a lifetime happy and satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
They're not, in other words, they fail to deliver.
Mm-hmm.
And when they fail, where do you go?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's so important that churches see themselves as refuges for other failed plausibility structures. Russell Moore said this years ago when he came to Immanuel to do a piece in the city. When this sexual revolution fails, like the last one did in the 60s, where are people going to go? Are they going to come to your church? Not if you've been throwing stones at them the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we just have to be convinced, and we need to feel really good that what we are doing together, John 13:34 and 35, the way that we are loving one another, which is just the way that Jesus is loving us, that itself is the defining evangelistic mark of our faith. It's what Jesus is committed to. John 13:35, by this all men will know you're my disciples, by the love you have for one another, is as much a promise as an observation. It's Jesus saying, here is what I'm going to publicize in the world. Not your great preaching, but your great loving.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just naive enough to take Jesus at his word.
Yeah.
And say, if we really love one another like that, the word will get out. And again,
Yes.
Schaeffer's L'Abri is a great example of that.
Yes, absolutely. And then can you just tie in, okay, so we have the plausibility structure, which you've done a good job on explaining it. Like, I feel like I'm starting to get it. But then you also tied in John 13:35 somehow into that. What was that connection?
Well, John 13:34 and 35 is describing a social reality. and a community that really did exist. And, of course, we have to remember the Gospels were written after Jesus had ascended to heaven. And then the Holy Spirit was sent down. The Holy Spirit was a teacher. We're actually told in John that the Holy Spirit was going to bring to remembrance the things that Jesus had taught. So it's not as if, this is fascinating to me, it's not as if those apostles walked around behind Jesus with a notebook. And here's why I say that. Jesus gave them the culture as and even before he gave them the doctrine. They knew what it meant to live inside of a Christian culture before they ever had, for instance, a doctrine of the Trinity. We tend to come at it from the other direction.
Mm-hmm.
I think, well, I hope, my prayer is that Immanuel becomes the opposite of that, where people can experience the culture as they're coming alive to the doctrine. In other words, we want Immanuel to be a place where people can sit and experience the culture that the doctrine creates. And then when they come to hear the doctrine, they just think, well, of course, because I've seen that embodied.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus gives them the culture, and then he sends the Holy Spirit, and then they write down what actually happened, understanding then what was happening to them at that time. They didn't know. They were being carried along by Jesus. They didn't know what was happening really until Jesus showed them. So my point is that when John went to write the New Commandment, he knew the community he was describing. It was describing the community he was living in, and the community that he knew Jesus was calling them to build out. So John, the Gospel of John is it's very communal. There's a lot about loving one another because John is building out that culture in his own day, and the letters of John later, the epistles of John, just go even further on that front. So John 13:34 and 35, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you, is not actually a new commandment. We're already told to love our neighbor as ourselves, right? So what's really the difference? The difference is revelation. Now more has been revealed to us. Now we know what it looks like to love your neighbor perfectly. It looks like Jesus. Jesus is the only person who ever actually obeyed what we call the golden rule. He really did love others as he loved himself. And that explains how he went to the cross. Even more than that. It explains a whole lot that we don't have time to get into. But Jesus, in other words, it's a new commandment because now we have new revelation in Jesus. It's really just an old commandment run through the cross.
Yes.
So that new commandment is the summation of how, Jesus was once asked in another gospel, Matthew, what are the two greatest commandments? He says, love God and then love your neighbor as yourself. So those are the two. You sum up all the commandments in those two. But in the new commandment, you get them in one. In loving Jesus, I am loving God. Jesus is God. In obeying Jesus, or just turning around and giving that love away, loving my neighbor, I'm keeping both commandments together. Jesus himself feels loved. Now, how do I get there? In the book of Acts, Jesus confronts the Apostle Paul, and he doesn't say to him, Paul, why are you persecuting my church? He says to him, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Jesus so identifies with his church, his disciples. He put his spirit inside of them. He's so present in them that in loving you, when I love Kent Lapp, Jesus feels loved. So I can keep both commandments at once inside of a Christian church.
Wow.
Yeah. I wasn't planning to go that far, and hopefully it wasn't heretical, but I think
it's not.
I
No.
pieced it all together right.
No, thank you. That's great. That's fantastic. You were going to say something, and I have a thought too.
Well, I just want to say that doesn't take away from the uniqueness of Jesus. This isn't I'm not saying something weird here. I'm just acknowledging that inside of John 13:34 and 35 is creating a culture. In other words, you can't be obedient to John 13:34 and 35 without creating a church. And you can call it whatever you want, but you're going to create a social environment if you are obedient to Jesus's new commandment.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a big thought too. It kind of strikes me that this concept of a plausibility structure is actually baked into the Bible all along. Because I'm
Yes.
thinking of, by their deeds, you shall know them. I'm thinking of James is talking about basically connecting head knowledge to actions.
Yes.
All of those things, those are biblical principles. Plausibility structure is reinforcing the fact that we can't just go through life with some thoughts or beliefs that don't affect actions.
That's exactly right.
And then it further occurs to me, just as a real practical thing, because I have kids, is it's also unplausible, implausible, whatever, aplausible, whatever the inverse of that is, to teach our kids Christian faith, take them to church on Sunday, and not do anything else. That's not going to work. It's not plausible, because what you're trying to do at that point, it'd be akin to trying to start a cult and having all of your members on a different country.
Yeah.
It's not going to work. They're in your house, and if you're telling them that you believe in God and you love God, and some meals you pray before, and then a lot of times you go to church on Sunday, maybe or maybe not, and that's it.
Yeah.
That's not going to end well, but for the grace of God, right? Because they're hearing you say something, but they're not seeing it, and that's just not designed to work.
Yeah, that's right. You were actually discipling them in something else altogether, which it probably falls under the banner of secularism. There was a shift in Berger's thinking. He was one of the first people to recognize that the modern world is not actually characterized by secularism. It's characterized by pluralism. Secularism is a peculiarly Western thing. But the world is not actually growing more secular. It's growing more religious. It's growing more pluralistic. So secularism is a big topic to get into, but I think it still does hold true. Although the world is becoming more pluralistic, more religious, secularism is a kind of Western religion in which we jumble all these things up together. It doesn't have much definition. It's one of the reasons that we're so homeless, because there aren't legitimations. We're taking those away even. So in doing that, basically we're creating ideologically homeless children when we do that.
Yes.
And then, so we're just saying, hey, go figure it out yourself.
Yeah.
Which is ridiculous.
Yeah, it is. And I'm super convicted by that, because I can see I've got massive room for improvement on that front, because there's gaps there. There's gaps there in my household.
Oh, yeah.
I can see it now.
In all of us. And it's one of the reasons that one of the maybe the most important ingredients to a Christian plausibility structure is an answer for sin. We talked about anomie or lawlessness. There's the lawlessness in the world, but what about the one in my own heart that I can't even do the thing I want to do?
Mm-hmm.
How do I make sense of that? And a Christian plausibility structure, that is to say, just a Christian world that works, must recognize and take into account and have categories for what is going on inside of me. It's the reason that at Immanuel we lean heavily into walking in the light, confessing sin to one another, because all of us are falling short of our best intentions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how do you explain that?
Yeah.
The Bible's got a really good explanation.
Yes. Yep. All right. Well, we were going to talk about Charles Spurgeon, but I don't think we have time for that. So I'm glad we went as deep on the plausibility structure as we did, actually. And you mentioned that Charles Spurgeon is one of your favorite preachers.
He's my favorite.
Is your favorite preacher.
No doubt.
Didn't he have a quote somewhere? Didn't he say one time that, like, what did he say? It was something like, "Why would you smoke a cigar when you can smoke two?" What was that quote? Do you know what I'm saying?
He had several cigar quotes. He must have been bumping up against objections there.
Yeah, he definitely was. It was something along those lines. But I was like, I just think of Charles Spurgeon as like a man's man.
Oh,
you know what I mean? Just like this big kind of, godly man's man. You know, like I'd love to have, man, wouldn't it be so great to go smoke a cigar with him?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. You kidding me? If I could go back in time, it would definitely be a stop off there in Victoria, in England.
Yeah, for sure. But even though we don't have time to get into it, anything you wanted to touch on with Spurgeon, or maybe why he's one of your favorite, or why he is your favorite preacher?
Well, I would just say go read Spurgeon.
Mm-hmm.
He's timeless in reading him because he preaches the beauty of Christ from every text. And sometimes he chooses the wrong, he preaches a sermon that he could have probably chosen a better text for. But the man was just filled with Christ. He loved Jesus. He talks about Jesus, describes Jesus in the way that I hear, a lot of modern people describe, their hikes into nature or something, like when they wax eloquently on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was the whole landscape for Spurgeon, and he's constantly inventing ways to speak affectionately about him. And therefore, his preaching is just nearly timeless. It works in every age because we never grow beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I read Spurgeon, because he brings me back to the center. And he makes me realize, like, TJ, like, yeah, like what? So if you preach a great sermon to modern people, so if you have the best arguments, but aren't you really here to enjoy Jesus? And if you're not doing that, then what are you really doing?
Mm.
He's always bringing me back to that place. So,
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot to read. There's 63 and growing because they found lost sermons from at least 63 volumes of Spurgeon sermons.
Wow. It's easy, like it's comprehensible. Like it's he
Yeah.
writes it kind of at a level of like an every man can understand.
He really does. I mean, he had this sort of the classic Victorian era British, there's a lot of adjectives and adverbs, and very descriptive. He almost spoke in poetry. He just a kind of a freak of nature in his abilities, So I don't really try to imitate Spurgeon.
Mm-hmm.
I can't. Jessica will tell me you tried to do Spurgeon today, didn't you?
Oh, really? Oh, yeah?
She knows when I'm
In your
when I'm-
sermon?
Oh yeah, she knows.
Oh, really?
She knows
I'm going
when
to
I-
start watching for that.
Yeah, when I dip into Spurgeon, she knows it's not good.
Oh, wow.
So I think he's not always the best person to imitate in terms of the style of his preaching.
Mm-hmm.
But in the heart of his preaching, he's great, and he's a great reader of the Bible in that I think he understands what the Bible's for.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't always agree with his exegesis and things like that, but man, how do you praise someone higher than other than saying like they bring me nearer to Jesus? So
Yeah, exactly.
that's what I'm reaching for.
Yes, yeah. Well, you do that, brother.
Oh, thanks, man.
Yeah, you do that. Yeah. Keep preaching. And if you have any final thoughts to leave with the listeners, that'd be great. Then we'll wrap this up. But I just want to say something since we're right here, man. My day is so much better since you came by, man. This is great. I mean, you kind of made my week. This is really good. I mean, some weekends it's like, well, it was a busy weekend. We had family in town and just all this, there's always plenty going on, right? In all of our lives. So like, just to be able to have you come by on a Monday afternoon and sit here for a couple hours.
Oh, thank you, brother.
This is wonderful, man. I
Well,
really appreciate it.
It was a real privilege for me. And it's easy for me to, I look forward to talking with you because there's not, I want your listeners to know this, there's not a Kent Lapp podcast version of you and then a Kent Lapp behind the scenes version of you.
Mm-hmm.
You're Kent Lapp through and through.
Yeah.
You're not just honest in your speech, you're honest in your life. So thank you for being that man.
Yeah.
And for including me on these things that, that really someone much more interesting than me should be included
No,
on.
man,
So
this is
for
fantastic.
roping me
No,
in.
this is great. Anything you do want to leave the listeners with?
Oh man. Well, we're going into probably the darkest holiday season that most of us, I'm 37, that most of us have lived through because we're isolated. And isolation is really harder than war. And so I think here's something I'd like to leave them with. Jesus says in Matthew 11:29, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest for your souls. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. So that's not a doctrine that lives on a shelf. It's a doctrine that's meant to be experienced. It's a reality that is open to everyone. And when we're experiencing the darkness of isolation, that promise is available to us. And Jesus is not going to say, well, you didn't want me in the good times, so why should I give myself to you in the bad? He's open to us right now. So I don't want to see anybody quit.
Mm-hmm.
Quit on life
Mm-hmm.
when it's just right there available to us in
Mhm.
Christ.
Yeah. Amen. All right, brother.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, love you,
Appreciate
man.
it.